Several years ago, I wrote over 1,000 explanations for the logical reasoning questions in LSAT prep tests 46 to 65. At first, I went in assuming that the hardest questions would be a mess of logic. I imagined them like unpredictable beasts, each one a new flavor of difficulty, an unfamiliar trap that would send test takers spiraling. But as I dissected them, question after question, week after week, I discovered something that genuinely shocked me. The hardest questions were not random at all. Instead, they followed strict patterns, consistent blueprints that repeated test to test. It turned out the difficulty, rather than arising from chaos, actually came from a carefully choreographed structure. And that's the hidden truth I want to reveal today. When you understand these patterns, you stop fearing the hardest questions and start leveraging them instead. First, for those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my own LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. Now, most students assume that difficulty equals unpredictability. Everyone expects the tough LSAT questions to be wild, off the wall, full of obscure topics in language, and at first glance, this seems true. The topics are definitely strange, maybe a complicated detail about economic policy, or a tricky piece of philosophy presented in dense technical language. But lurking beneath these thematic veneers are patterns that remain consistent. Top scorers, the ones who consistently hit 175 plus, rely on this exact predictability. They know something most test takers don't. Complexity doesn't mean randomness. Complexity in a test as standardized as the LSAT emerges instead from logical structures that recur again and again. Let's call this the difficulty paradox. The difficulty paradox is the idea that as question difficulty ramps up, as the stakes get higher, the test makers actually tighten the patterns. They adhere to more rigorous standards and produce more intricate yet more formulaic reasoning structures. Instead of making the hardest questions wild and creative in unpredictable ways, they make them harder by layering standard logical constructs in a precise fashion. In other words, a very hard question isn't a radical departure from the test's logic. It's actually the test's logic on full display. Every common flaw or subtlety shining brightly saying, "Look over here," once you know what to look for. While I worked through these 1,000+ logical reasoning explanations, I began noticing recurring frameworks. Let's break down a few consistent patterns that characterize these challenging questions. First, hard questions frequently revolve around known flawed argument types, causal confusions, conditional reasoning gaps, comparisons without proper baselines, or sampling errors that follow a predictable mold. There's a finite set of these logical blueprints, and the LSAT recycles them diligently, especially in the hardest questions. These patterns are not randomly chosen, they're carefully curated to ensure fairness and reliability in the test. That's how they maintain the integrity of the LSAT. Once you learn to label these frameworks, a puzzle you once saw as unique and incomprehensible starts instead to look like a familiar problem you've solved many times before. Second, the answer choices in the hardest questions don't spring out of nowhere. They're not 5 arbitrary sentences thrown together A through E. They are instead meticulously crafted traps and correct answers that have a consistent feel to them. In the hard questions, the right answer often articulates the flaw or assumption in a crisp, technical way. It's rarely easy or obvious at first glance, but if you've trained yourself to recognize the underlying argument pattern, the correct choice stops looking random and starts looking instead like a perfect match. The wrong answers, in contrast, predictably miss the core flaw by focusing on irrelevant details, restating the premise in a way that sounds smart but doesn't actually address the central logical gap, or twisting a subtle term in the argument's wording to mislead you. These misdirections are not infinite in variety. They cycle through a limited set of common temptations. Once you grasp that these traps repeat, you develop a kind of intuitive muscle memory for detecting them. Third, the language itself is more predictable than you might think. Hard questions often rely on specific linguistic cues, conditional terms, comparative phrases, quantifiers like most or some, and subtle shifts in tone that signal a particular logical chain. For instance, again and again, you'll see that when a question tries to trick you with a correlation-causation flaw, it slips in certain telltale wording, hints of a temporal sequence, or a shift from associated with to causes. After writing over 1,000 explanations, it becomes undeniable. These linguistic choices are not random. They are consistent markers of the reasoning pattern beneath the surface. This might seem counterintuitive, because you might be thinking, how could the hardest questions be the most structured and repetitive? Shouldn't difficulty mean inventiveness, new types of traps every single time? But the LSAT can't risk inconsistency. It can't break its own standards. The test is designed to be reliable. If the logic of the LSAT were genuinely chaotic, it wouldn't be a fair measure. So instead, the test makers heap complexity onto stable frameworks. Imagine a very intricate dance routine. Every movement is predetermined and choreographed. To the untrained eye, it looks impossible. But to someone who's learned and practiced these moves, it's entirely recognizable. That's how top scorers approach these questions. They've seen the patterns so many times that what seems like a chaotic puzzle to a newcomer is just another variation on a theme they already know well. Consider the difference between how you feel facing a brand new type of task versus something you've done over and over. If you witnessed a logical pattern 50 times, you become comfortable identifying it. You know what signals it, how it's typically twisted, how the LSAT tries to throw you off. This familiarity transforms your mental state when you face a hard question. Instead of panic, you approach it with more of a checklist mentality. ID the structure, confirm the known patterns, spot the characteristic wrong answers. You trust the process because you've seen it yield results time after time. When I dissected the hardest questions from LSAT prep tests 46 through 65, I was surprised to find that many seemingly new twists were just old patterns in disguise. A new topic, maybe about a niche environmental regulation, doesn't matter if the logic is the same correlation to causation jump you've studied countless times. A question involving obscure philosophical jargon can still follow the same flawed analogy pattern or unjustified comparison structure that appeared in other tests with more familiar subject matter. Over time, the content's superficial strangeness fades, and you start to see the skeleton of the question's logic. And once you see the skeleton, it's almost impossible to unsee it. This shift in perspective changes how you study and prepare for the LSAT. Instead of treating each hard question as a completely separate beast, you begin grouping them by their underlying patterns. You train to spot common flawed reasoning structures, to recognize linguistic cues that signal each pattern's presence, and to ID the standard misdirection strategies and answer choices. By doing so, you are effectively internalizing the logic of the test. The payoff here is enormous, because when you go into the actual LSAT, you don't flinch at a so-called hard question. Instead, you think to yourself, I know this pattern. I've dealt with it before. You become more efficient and more accurate at the same time. And this is what happens with our students at LSAT Unplugged. We show you the patterns through our live online classes via Zoom, our on-demand video courses, our small group coaching, and our one-on-one coaching. We put you on a personalized day-by-day study plan to build your foundation and walk you through whichever questions that seem hard for you so that you get them wrong now, you learn the patterns now, so you don't get them wrong on test day because you'll have seen it all before. If you'd like my help adopting this process, mastering the patterns of the test, you could check out the links below this video to find out more and to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. Now, the hardest questions only feel difficult to you right now, not because they're unrecognizable, but because they're denser and more carefully assembled. You haven't been through the process of breaking them down yet. The test makers know that to challenge top scorers, they have to rely on subtlety. But subtlety is not achieved by chaos. They only seem chaotic because you haven't learned the structure of the question yet. You can break down the patterns of the test and see the subtlety by refining and perfecting your understanding of the structure to the point that your eye is trained to spot what is going on. Once you've trained yourself, you'll have that eye. You'll know what a correct answer to a classic causation flaw looks like, and you'll know what a tempting wrong answer that tries to lure you off track typically says. And you know how the question stem's wording is leading you toward the pattern you've already ID'd dozens of times. That's what we do with the Socratic review method in our classes, in our on-demand video course, and in our one-on-one coaching programs. The true insight here is that understanding the test's construction changes your emotional response. That's critical because anxiety and confusion slow you down. When you know you can rely on recurring patterns, you feel a sense of control. The hardest questions no longer appear as obstacles you must blindly charge at. They become predictable puzzles you know how to solve. Think of it like learning a language. At the start, every new sentence is baffling, but after enough practice, you start to recognize grammatical patterns, common idioms, and sentence structures that come up repeatedly. Eventually, you can anticipate what's coming next just from a few initial clues. The LSAT's hardest questions are like sentences in that advanced language. At first, they seem impossible, but with enough exposure and analysis, they become just another dialect you're fluent in. All of this means that if you're currently intimidated by the toughest logical reasoning questions, you might be focusing on the wrong aspect. Don't be alarmed by the complexity of the subject matter or by the length of the question. Instead, train yourself to see the underlying skeleton of logic. Devote time to understanding and internalizing the common flawed reasoning templates. Examine real sets of prep test questions and map out how the test consistently returns to the same well of logical structures. Over time, this approach builds your intuition, so when you face a new hard question, you'll instantly recognize it as just another iteration of a known pattern. If you can view difficulty through this lens, you turn what's a source of stress for others into a strategic advantage for you. Top scorers often say they actually find the hardest questions more comfortable in a strange way because these questions are more faithful to the LSAT's core logical patterns. Once you've achieved that perspective, your accuracy and speed rise together, and the stress you felt facing complex, layered questions dissolves. The key takeaway here is that difficulty on a test like the LSAT isn't random. It's constructed, and like any well-constructed object, it follows blueprints. When you learn those blueprints, the test loses the power to intimidate you. That's how understanding the difficulty paradox transforms your performance. Hard questions become less about trying to overcome chaos and more about applying the patterns you've studied. And this is the key shift. It's available to anyone who invests the time to look beneath the surface. It's about memorizing the logic that all tough questions share. So embrace the paradox of difficulty on the LSAT. It's the map that turns what you once perceived as a minefield into well-charted territory. And once you understand these predictable structures, you won't worry about a question that supposedly seems hard. Instead, you'll think, I've done this before. And you'll be able to confidently and easily find the correct answer. This is the shocking truth I learned from writing explanations for over 1,000 real LSAT logical reasoning questions. The hardest questions do follow strict patterns, and once you master them, they're no longer your enemy. This is one of the many lessons I share with my students at LSAT Unplugged. If you'd like my help on your journey to scoring a 170 plus, you could check out the links below to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. And in the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.